Smith & Wesson's sales plummet, plus a conversation with Georgetown Professor William English on his groundbreaking new survey of American gun owners. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to check out the top stories of the week in gun politics across America. All the biggest stories, one email, and it's free, and you'll have a good idea of what's going on across the country. And if you want to support our work, our sober, serious approach to journalism, you can also buy a membership, which will get you exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and special reports that you can't get anywhere else. You'll also get access to this podcast a day early and the opportunity to appear on the show in a member segment. So make sure you head over and check out our membership options today. This week, we have Professor William English from Georgetown, who is on to talk about a really fascinating survey that he conducted. It's really the largest survey of gun owners ever done that has some really incredible findings that are not getting much attention to this point. Welcome to the show, Professor English. Can you just tell people a little bit more about yourself before we begin?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you for having me. So I'm a professor at Georgetown in our business school, and we have a department of strategy, economics, ethics, and public policy. This is a place I was really happy to land in 2016, in part because the department is so interdisciplinary, and that reflects a bit of my own interdisciplinary backgrounds and interests. So my PhD is in political science, and that's a discipline that allows me to both think broadly about issues in political theory, history, problems of governance, security, but I also have a background in math and economics, and it's a discipline that allows me to do empirical social science work, policy evaluation, and the business school has been a great place to be able to do both of those. But since a fairly young age, I've been interested in what I might call the science and theory of the Second Amendment. And the last year or two, I've been working on a book project where I'm trying to think about, both the historical and social theory, social science aspects of gun debates, but also trying to evaluate the empirical literature as it exists today to really hone in on sort of, where are the most interesting differences in our assessment of sort of current gun use, current gun abuse, gun ownership trends, gun distribution patterns, and see if we can shed some light from a social scientific view on just the reality of how guns are used and owned in America today. So this survey was conducted in 2021, and the attempt was to make it the largest survey of gun owners yet done, particularly so that we could get statistically informative information in all 50 states. So this was sort of the initial ambition. And just to put this in context, probably the last survey of this scope was done back in 1994. Phil Cook and Jens Ludwig did a very classic, well-done survey of gun owners, the types of guns they owned, of the reasons for owning guns. And that's a study that gets cited all the time, but it's now more than a quarter century old. And there have been a number of more recent surveys, but I saw an opportunity here to do a survey that was both statistically informative across all states and drilled down to many details that aren't asked in sort of conventional just ownership surveys at the highest level. Do you own a gun or not? And the attempt was to be able to say something more about actual gun ownership and use patterns that are relevant to many of the debates we're having today.
Yeah, and so let's start with some of those top lines that you found in the survey. This was 16,700 gun owners that were identified, and you asked them a series of questions. And some of the biggest takeaways, I think, are, we've got the diversity, the increasing diversity of gun ownership in America, the popularity of gun carry among gun owners, and then especially the number of defensive gun uses per year. This has been a long-term conversation or debate in the United States surrounding guns. This is one of the key areas that people debate over, whether it's worth owning guns or not. A lot of that comes down to how how realistic is it that people will actually defend themselves with guns? And a lot of the data on that, as you just noted there, is from 30 years ago. It's still the center of our debate today. But your survey found that there were more than 1.6 million defensive gun uses per year in the United States. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And maybe I'll talk about each of those observations sort of in turn here. The first thing I noticed, you're always comparing, how does your survey match up with other surveys that are recent, but also how have things changed over the last, 2 or 3 decades. And I was really encouraged the sort of top line results of the survey matched very well other recent done surveys by Pew and others, Gallup, in terms of how many people own guns. But one thing we've noticed, if you compare back to, say, the 1990 surveys that we see, is that gun owners have become way more diverse. So the numbers of Hispanics, of Asians, of Blacks, and of women who are owning firearms are all up dramatically from where they were 20, 30 years ago. And that's sort of interesting, just as a top line result, because I think a lot of our perceptions end up kind of rooted in these old surveys from decades ago. And really, the patterns of gun ownership have changed fairly significantly over the last 2 or 3 decades.
And I would say too that also it confirms some recent data that we've got from sources that are a little bit less solid. I would say for instance, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the gun industry's trade group, they do a dealer survey, and that survey asks dealers to estimate how many of their customers they are of one race or another, and that's how they come up with their numbers for increasing diversity in gun ownership, which is obviously not as straightforward as just asking people themselves. But it seems that this survey, where you do that, does show that a similar result in this increase in Black gun ownership, female gun ownership, Asian American, Latino American gun ownership. And so it's really interesting in that regard that it's backing up some of these more informal surveys.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. A lot of the stuff you kind of would notice a bit if you're just looking at industry trends and sort of marketing trends and casually going to gun stores and stuff. You might see this, but it really is showing up in the data. So just some overall numbers here: approximately 1 out of 4 African Americans own firearms now. Even more than that, about 28% of Hispanics own firearms. About 20% of Asians own firearms, and for whites, it's around 34%. But we're that number has held pretty steady. But in all these other groups, those are significant changes, significant rises. And what's even more interesting is some of these demographics of gun ownership are even more in greater parity when we start to look at things like AR-15 style rifle ownership and magazine ownership and that sort of thing. But the other big trend that showed up kind of on the surface very quickly, which matches sort of what's going on also on the legal side, is compared to the 1990 surveys, a lot of people who are saying they carry guns for self-defense. And we asked this question sort of in a few different levels and ways, trying to ascertain if there are people that sort of ever carried a gun. And it might include on their property. It might include in a state where you don't need a permit to carry. And over half of gun owners said that at some point they do carry a handgun for personal protection. And then we try to drill down to ascertain the frequency of carrying, how often, for what purposes, and whatnot. And approximately, we're getting, and I'll just get the number here directly, but something like 20-30%. I'm going to pull this up just so I have it in front of me. Of people are saying that they're actually, carrying with some frequency. And the other thing that was interesting is, so about 35% of gun owners said that they had wanted to carry a handgun for self-defense in some circumstance where they weren't allowed to. And sort of in the light of the Bruin ruling that recently came out, I thought that was a kind of interesting thing to note, that we've seen a lot of legislative change over the past 2 or 3 decades in terms of the right to carry in individual states. And now the Supreme Court has affirmed that is a more general right guaranteed by the Second Amendment. So this, that's definitely showing up in the data as well, that there's more people than 2 or 3 decades ago who are saying that they carry regularly for the purpose of self-defense.
And so that sort of implies as well that there's perhaps going to be even more people carrying for self-defense in the near future because of Bruin. And now obviously there's a lot of political machinations that have continue to prevent many people in California and New York from carrying guns, even in the aftermath of Bruin. It'll probably take a little while for that all to get sorted out. But the survey seems to, from what you're saying, it seems to indicate that there is even greater potential for Americans to carry, a larger percentage to carry guns.
Yeah, that's right. And so just to get the precise numbers, so it's about 35% of gun owners that report carrying a handgun with some frequency. So that's saying they carry sometimes, often, or almost, or always. And
that's like tens of millions of people, right? Yeah.
And we estimate also how many people are regularly carrying under a concealed carry regime. And there's some states with now constitutional carry or permitless carry, which is going to make this a little harder to estimate in years going forward. But it looks like around 20 million Americans are carrying on a regular basis right now under, this is in 2021, but carrying on a regular basis under a kind of permit regime. So that's approximately a quarter of gun owners. And I suspect that, those numbers may go up in the post-Bruin period.
Fascinating. And then as far as defensive gun uses go, this is a very core question in the gun debate. How often do people actually use firearms to defend themselves? Because you'll see estimates that are, range across the spectrum from maybe, tens of thousands of times a year up to 2.5 million times per year. Your survey puts the number at 1.6 million. Can you just explain a little bit more about how you got to that number, how it's different from some of these other estimates, especially like some of the previous survey estimates, like the CLEC surveys in the 90s?
Yeah. So, maybe the first thing to note is that, this estimate around 1.6 million is in line with some of these classic surveys from a decade or two ago, as well as some more recent surveys. But one of the challenges with ascertaining defensive gun use is how you define that. So something that has shown up consistently in the literature, and it shows up in a big way in this survey, is that most defensive gun use, over 80% of the times that people are indicating they're using a gun to defend themselves, a shot is not fired. And and what we wanted to do in this survey is really get at sort of any cases for which someone thought a firearm was used in self-defense. And so we asked two sorts of questions. One was a straightforward question. Have you ever used a firearm to defend yourself? And we explicitly excluded work in the military as a police officer, as a security guard. So we're not interested in professional uses. And if someone answered yes to that, then we asked them a number of detailed questions. How many times have you used a gun to defend yourself? What sort of firearm did you use? How many assailants were there? Did you fire a shot? If you fired a shot, how many? So we have some really granular data on that. And then as a separate question, because you can imagine other scenarios where you might, be on your property with a rifle on your shoulder, on your land, and there's some dispute, and somebody, when they notice your arm, they politely walk away, or maybe a friend comes to your aid with a firearm that's displayed, but you didn't use it. So we have a different question asking about these more sort of softer marginal cases where the presence of a firearm might have deterred aggression against somebody.
Oh, interesting.
So that's a separate question. But on the straight defensive gun use question, we also asked, did you brandish the firearm? Did you shoot the firearm? Did you, verbally announce you had a firearm? So we have a breakdown of how these things happened. And what does show up is that, yes, in most cases, it's simply the brandishing of a firearm or the knowledge that somebody has a firearm, the threat that is able to deter crime. And so, one thing this means is if you're trying to ascertain defensive gun use through other measures, there's a debate in the literature. Should you look at, emergency room numbers, the amount of people who come in with gunshot wounds? And on the surface of it, those numbers, are in the tens of thousands, generally under 100,000. And the
Right.
question
Yeah.
is,
The common critique there is that survey-based estimates are overestimating how common these events are. And actually, before we talk a little bit more about the emergency room and some of the other ways people estimate lower rates of defensive gun use, one of the key critiques of the CLEC surveys and the other surveys from the 90s is that they asked whether or not you used a gun in self-defense in the past year, and so there was a lot of concern that people maybe overestimated how recently their use of a gun for self-defense is. Now, you've addressed this concern in this survey, right? You asked this question in a different way.
Yeah, and so this is a really interesting sort of critique, and it's what social scientists are often kind of thinking about in subtle, sophisticated ways. And the argument is this: that if you have a survey that asks, did you use a gun in self-defense in the last year? Probably using a gun in self-defense is a pretty memorable thing. That's going to stick in someone's memory. But the precise length of time that has passed, that might be a little fuzzy. So, if somebody defended themselves with a gun the previous summer, we're talking in September right now, maybe that's actually 13 months away. But you might say, just last year I defended myself. Or maybe it's 14 months or 15 months. So the worry then is if you're then using this yearly metric to calculate defensive gun uses, you might have a lot of respondents that did use guns defensively, but used it slightly beyond that year-long boundary. And that's going to perhaps inflate the number of defensive gun uses that you're counting within a single calendar year. Right. So it's a plausible concern and a thoughtful thing to be worried about. So what we did in the survey is we asked if you've ever used a firearm in self-defense. So this is any time in your life. And I do think those are memorable events. So there's something that somebody might remember, even if it was 5-10 years ago. And, if they say that, we ask also, how many times has this happened? And we drill down on all of those. And for each incident, we're asking a whole bunch of detail. But what that means is that we get an overall report for gun owners of how often, or if at all, they've used guns defensively. And what you can then do is back out in terms of the life years represented by the survey respondents in the survey, and say, how much does that actually amount to per year? So, from what's indicated in our survey, it's around 50 million defensive uses that we're counting. But that's, of course, over people who might be, 80 years old compared to 18 years old. So we're actually then calculating based on the life years represented in the survey respondents, what does that look like per year? And it's really interesting that when you back those numbers out, you end up with this estimate 1.67, which is very tightly aligned with prior estimates. And I should also note that it's, if anything, I think this is a conservative estimate because... Right, yeah, actually, let's talk about that real quick. One, I do think it's fascinating that using a totally different methodology for estimating yearly defensive gun uses, you still come out to what is in the range of those previous survey estimates. So that's, to me, that signals there's perhaps more credibility to these estimates that this is how often Americans say that they've used guns in self-defense. And now it did come out on the lower end of that range because the CLEC range was something between 1.6 and 2.5 million per year. But can you talk a little bit about why that might be and why, as you just said, you think your estimate might be actually a bit of an undercount? Yeah. So there's two things that we can't capture in this survey. One is this survey is only going to those who are 18 and older. So certainly there's many millions of people under the age of 18 who hunt, who are involved in shooting sports. Teenagers who are proficient in the use of guns and whatnot, and you do see reports in the news every so often of 14-year-old, 16-year-old, 17-year-old who defends their family at home from an invader or a robber, that sort of thing. So there might be some defensive uses in that under 18 age group that we're not capturing. But the bigger issue that we can't get at with this survey is if somebody is not currently a gun owner, they wouldn't have been filtered into the full part of our survey that asks all these questions. But CLEC found something really interesting in some of his early work, which is that a number of people who indicated that they'd used a gun in self-defense weren't personally the owners of that gun. So you might have a wife whose husband owns a gun, and in this survey, the husband might indicate, yeah, I'm a gun owner. The wife would say, yeah, I'm not a gun owner, but the wife might have used a gun in self-defense and somebody trying to break in the house. And that population, it was actually pretty large in some of Kleck's estimates, up to 40%, I believe, in one of his surveys, where you had people who had used a gun for self-defense at some point in their history who weren't themselves personal gun owners or owning that particular gun. So that we're also not able to capture that group. And just as sort of a robustness exercise, if we go in and calculate based on Kleck's estimates, how many people that might encompass that weren't in our survey, we do get up in that sort of 2.5 million range. So so it is, sort of all methods of triangulating this are coming up with similar sets of answers. And, there's other things going on in the background. Certainly population has grown a bit in the United States in the last 2 decades, but also crime has come down for most of the last 3 decades. It's certainly coming up the last year or two.
So that's why you might see a lower rate.
So you might see a lower rate. You also have a higher population. So, but all these numbers are really, in the same neighborhood, which does give us more confidence that that we're really picking up, something real, a phenomenon that is persistent over time and really captures the behavior of gun owners in America. And again, and this is a sample of 15,000, 16,000 gun owners who are consistently reporting these sorts of levels of self-defense.
Yeah. No, I mean, just having another very well put together piece of evidence to point to that's not 30 years old is I think very important in this debate, because oftentimes the gun debate gets stuck 30 years ago with the same arguments over the same evidence, and we don't update our what we're talking about very often. I mean, we're still talking about the Sullivan's ban that expired in 2004, and the same Kleck surveys that were from the mid 90s. And although one thing that you've seen recently, to get back to something we were talking about just a moment ago, you've seen a concerted effort, I think, among a lot of gun control advocates to challenge this idea that gun use is common for self-defense in the United States. And so they've taken a critical look at these survey-based results, and they argue that they're overrepresentative. They overestimate how common gun uses are, because looking at things such as news reports on self-defense use of guns, or emergency room admittance for gunshot wounds, or death certificates, just the FBI's justified homicide count is far lower than, of course, 1.6 million defensive gun uses per year. And so they argue that these estimates are overblown. What is it that you would say to that sort of argument? How do you approach that critique?
Yeah, and so these are good questions to ask, I think, because certainly if you have like a Hollywood view of gunfights and gun use, you might think every defensive gun use involves a lot of shots and a lot of people hit, and there'd be evidence of that, and it show up in police reports. What I think is really important to understand is that what shows up in the media reports, or what shows up in hospitals, is a tip of an iceberg. But most defensive gun use, according to this survey and others, are incidents where no shot is fired. And if you drill down on the circumstances for which a shot is fired, so this less than 20%, something like 18% or so, then this raises the question: well, how often? Well, first of all, how many shots are fired, and how often would you expect somebody to actually be hit in that sort of exchange? And what's the nature of these exchanges? What's their purpose? It's fascinating there's been a number of studies of police shootings, and how often it is when a police officer pulls their firearm, is engaged in a firefight, and fires their gun, how often they hit their target. And it might surprise sort of non-gun owners, non-shooters, that something like 65 to 85% of the time, police officers are not connecting. They're not hitting the intended target with a bullet. But that's, for those who shoot, it's kind of, it's actually very difficult. You're under pressure. There's a lot of things going on. And police officers also, they're in the context of generally apprehending a suspect, and they have to prosecute this exchange to its conclusion. To either the criminal might get away, but these are close quarters, intense things that have to be go to their ultimate conclusions. For a defense of gun use, I think the main objective is to scare someone away, to escape, to become safe, to not be a victim. And so if you fire a single shot, to stop the attack. So if you fire a single shot and that scares a person away, and probably most intelligent criminals, if they see a gun or if they hear a shot, they're getting out of there. That's a successful defense of gun use, but that's not going to show up, certainly not in the hospital if you don't shoot them, if you don't connect. It's not going to show up in media reports. It's not going to, there's not going to be a police report filed in even some cases. And so if you kind of look at the numbers, if you're assuming that individual, citizen defenders are connecting in the area range that police do, then the gunshot numbers that actually show up in the literature are right on target in terms of, you're talking something in the tens of thousands perhaps. Something like, somewhere between under 100,000 people are showing up with gunshot wounds in hospitals and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So the numbers are definitely consistent with the survey results we're seeing. But the important thing to understand is, first, how many defensive gun uses don't result in a firearm being fired at all. Of those in which a firearm is fired, the modal number of shots fired is 1. And presumably this is because that's sufficient to deter an attack, to scare someone away.
Almost 50%, right?
Yeah, and I'd probably go back and look at that numbers. But
I believe the numbers were 87% didn't fire a single shot at all.
Yes. Or 81 or 82%. Yeah,
it's like 40 something percent fired one shot, and then after that there was one shot or 2 shots was the next most common, then 3 shots, and so forth.
Yeah, and just one other thing on the defensive gun use, because this also kind of it might be different than media perceptions, is we were finding enormous representation across all groups in terms of defensive gun use. So it's not a particular subgroup that's standing out here. So just to run through some of the top line results here, about 30% of white gun owners say they've used a gun in self-defense. About 26% of Asian gun owners say they used a gun in self-defense. And then these numbers are higher amongst some other minority groups, precisely because you might think they're more victimized by crime. So about 44% of black gun owners have indicated defensively using a firearm. About 40% of Hispanic gun owners have indicated using a firearm in defense. And for men and women, it's also not that much different. It's certainly not as different as some of the surveys suggested in 1990. So about 34% of men have indicated using a firearm in self-defense, and about 20% of women have indicated using a firearm in self-defense. I should say gun-owning men and gun-owning women. And so we're seeing that the defensive gun use is something that's common across all sort of gun-owning demographics, but it is heightened precisely in those demographics that you might think are more victimized by crime, given their locations in high crime areas in the United States.
Right. Yeah, that does seem to match up with the statistics you find about murder victims and violent crime victims. So that makes a lot of logical sense as to why it would work out that way. It's really important, I think, to talk about these new results because, again, like the core of the debate over guns in America is whether or not these are useful tools to protect people, or whether or not they just put people at more risk to harm themselves or others. That's the basic debate. I mean, obviously there are other reasons to own firearms, for, political reasons. The Second Amendment speaks directly to the idea of, an armed populace being necessary to defend a free state. And so, it's not the only reason, but it is the main reason that we debate in modern America is like, are guns actually useful for self-defense in a way that alleviates any downsides to owning firearms, or to having firearms in society generally. This is a common core to what we talk about when it comes to firearm ownership. And so having more data on this, especially data that's very broad, is incredibly important. And, actually one area that I think is fascinating about all of this too is that you were able to get a representative sample of gun owners in all 50 states, which is something that I've never seen done before. And frankly, is something that I've always had concerns about when we talk about gun research, because a lot of it relies on estimates for gun ownership in different areas that just never seemed terribly reliable to me. I think the RAND corporations, their estimate, or the way that they calculate it, has become the most popular one in recent years, which involves national surveys of a couple thousand adults, not even gun owners, that show, the gun ownership rate is something like 30%. And then they try to use that combined with, for instance, suicide data is a common metric that people will rely on for measuring gun ownership in a given area. But none of the, those all seemed fairly flimsy to me, or at least questionable to me. And now you have this survey that has directly obtained an actual representative sample in every state. Have you found some differences between what your gun ownership estimate is in those states and what you commonly see through these other metrics?
Yeah. This is a great question. And, it goes back, and I should mention, one of the challenges with survey work historically is it used to be really, really expensive. So before the internet, you'd have an army of people calling people up on the phone, random numbers across the United States, trying to get somebody to talk to you for half an hour to go through this long question and answer, survey, and the cost of doing that, but both monetary and logistical costs were really high. And one thing that has changed, particularly in the last decade, is we are much better with the internet of being able to reach out to really large numbers of people, also ensure representativeness, and engage them in a way that sort of ensures that they have the time and focus and incentive to sit down and answer questions. So that it is one of the things I'm most excited about with this survey, that it has such great coverage across the United States, and really statistically informative samples in all 50 states. And as you say, this has historically been things we didn't have good numbers on. The RAND paper, it's a good first attempt, and they should be applauded for this attempt to try to triangulate some of these estimates. But some of the things they use are things like the number of guns and ammo subscriptions, and you have this suicide rate, and you have hunting licenses. But of course, hunting licenses are going to be very different across different states and different contexts, and which states have a lot of hunters versus just recreational shooters. So on its face, there's a reason to think this is a pretty loose a methodological approach. And there's about 6 different papers I want to write from this survey. The paper out there right now is a top-line result. There's a lot of things I want to delve into more deeply. And I will at one point. Honestly. Yeah, I'm going to at one point write a piece on the RAND where some of the major large states we have some agreement on, but particularly the smaller states, I think their estimates are widely off. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in their methods, where at the extremes, I think they really underestimate and overestimate. And I did some looking at this maybe a few months ago, where some of the early estimates of state ownership, there were points where like Hawaii was showing up with 33% ownership. And that turns out they had asked like 3 people in Hawaii, and 1 out of 3 said yes. Right. And it's similar in Alaska. It's like they asked 4 people. And, we were making
and that's
really
the common
loose
problem with a lot of these other estimates. It's like, they're not asking a lot of people. When you do a nationwide survey to get a random sample, you only need 2,500 people or so,
right,
when you're talking about adults. But then if you try to drill that down to 33% of people who self-identify as gun owners, then you're only getting a couple hundred people for the entire country, which is why your sample size of 16,000 gun owners is such a game changer, at least in my view.
Yeah, that's right. And that's it's a really exciting thing. And I say that there's a lot of stuff that I haven't yet been able to analyze just because of time and some teaching commitments and other writing commitments. But eventually there will be a paper comparing and contrasting the RAND estimates. And I think this will be a major contribution because there's a lot of other studies people want to do that rely on sort of estimates of state level firearms ownership. And this can provide that. And so, eventually.
I mean, that's been one of my long running critiques of a lot of modern survey or a lot of studies that look at whatever gun policy effects is they oftentimes are using fairly unreliable estimates for gun ownership rates wherever, whatever area they're studying. There might be exceptions to this, like California obviously has a registry, Massachusetts has a registry, so maybe you can get a little bit more precise estimates of gun ownership in a given area. But oftentimes they're relying on these sort of questionable tactics to determine gun ownership rates, and those are key to a lot of the conclusions that they're drawing. And so, it'll be interesting to see perhaps how some of these studies come out with updated measurements of gun ownership that are in your survey. But the other thing I wanted to get to before, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want to talk a little bit about what you found in terms of the rate of ownership of some of the more controversial firearms and accessories out there, because this was also part of the study. Modern sporting rifles, assault weapons, whatever you want to call them, AR-15s and AK-47s, in other words, as well as magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. That these are often the targets of bans in deep blue areas, California, Massachusetts, New York. And so you've asked how common it is for people to own these, which is obviously a pretty relevant thing, especially in our new legal atmosphere since the Supreme Court's Bruin ruling.
Right.
Where how common, really since Heller, how common a gun is or accessory is matters quite a lot to whether or not it's protected by the Second Amendment.
Yeah, and this is something that kind of surprised me just a few years ago when I started getting into this research in more depth. Is we have all these public policy debates, but we don't always have kind of the precise data you'd want to inform those debates. And this is the ownership stuff is sort of just an obvious example. So going back in the 1994 survey that Cook and Ludwig did, they did drill down on a lot of questions of types of guns owned. Pistols, revolvers, shotguns, rifles. My recollection is I don't believe they asked about sort of AR-15, AK style platforms in particular. But this is certainly relevant today. So you get this question: are AR-15 style rifles these sort of exotic, rare things used by just a handful of gun nuts? Or are they, the most common actually rifle in America that's selling today? Are they widely owned? Are they widely used? For what purposes are they owned and used? And that was something I tried to get at in this survey. So, asked a series of questions about ownership, about use, about reasons people own them, and the sort of top line results here is that these are very widely owned. So in the AR AK platform style rifle. About 30% of gun owners, and this is something like almost 25 million people, indicate that they've owned these firearms. That's a huge number. 1 out of 3 gun owners have owned, what commonly derided as assault weapons. And the reasons they own these are things that might not surprise you. The most common reason is for recreational target shooting. And second most common reason, following almost statistically indistinguishable, is home defense. People are using they're owning these guns, using these guns for a variety of lawful purposes, and that shows up in a big way in this survey. The other thing that's interesting is there was a narrative out there sometimes that it's just a handful of people that own a bunch of these. Right. But we're seeing now the average owner owns 1 or 2 of these. Something like 96% of people own less than 10 who indicate ownership of these. So these are. It's not just there's a lot of them out there, but they're owned fairly widely. And this is also true when you break it down by ethnic demographics. So About a third of gun owners, white gun owners, own AR-15 AK style guns. About 34% of African Americans own these rifles. About 30% of Asian gun owners own these rifles, and about 38% of Hispanic gun owners own these sorts of rifles. So, and also male and female. It's about 36% of males gun owners, but about 21% of female gun owners. So they really are, widely used across all demographics, widely owned across all demographics. And that shows up in a very clear way in this survey. And similar sorts of findings for magazines. So, some debate in some states about the capacity of magazines, and we're seeing that, particularly with the popularity of AK styled rifles, as well as just how pistols have progressed over the last few decades, that about half of gun owners own magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. This is extremely common. Similarly, it's demographically, very well distributed across all different groups. And it's you might think, the magazine as a complement of modern firearms, the standard magazines that are used in firearms are often the ones that hold more than 10 rounds. So this shows up as well in the survey responses. It's not just concentrated in a few small groups, but it's a very wide pattern that you see ownership of these sorts of magazines.
Yeah, and I think this is another area where your survey kind of lends credence to some other reports that have come out in recent years. For instance, the National Shooting Sports Foundation again released a report just earlier this year that showed there have been 24.4 million what they call modern sporting rifles,
yeah.
But effectively that means AR-15s and AK-47s. In civilian circulation since 1990. Now that data is based on actual production records,
right.
So how many have actually been made and imported and sold in the United States. So it's a little more solid than I would say the dealer survey is. Not that the dealer survey, obviously the dealer survey is still a useful tool and clearly is backed up by what you found in this direct survey, but it's another instance where, what we've been hearing from the industry is in line with what gun owners are saying themselves when asked about whether they own these guns. Because, like you said, that the number breaks down to something like, above 20 million people report owning these guns. Although that does give perhaps even more insight, because as you said, as the survey found, most people own one or two of these kinds of firearms, and that math works out, right? If there's 20 million people who own them and 24.4 million of them out, in public hands since 1990, well, that works out to not 7 per person, right?
Yeah, and I should mention too that we asked this question in a fairly broad way. So we used this, we said, AR-15 style platforms, AK platforms, and other guns that might be, so-called assault weapons and that sort of thing. So we tried to capture sort of anything that would be in, publicly recognized as falling in these sorts of categories. So, there's many other guns that would probably show up there, Mini 14s, sure. FALs. If you think back to like the M130 carbine, there's something like 6 million of those produced near the end of the Second World War. And those are, many of those in civilian hands. So the AK AR-15 platforms, there's production numbers just since 1990 in that 25 million range. But there's probably a number of other chunks of similarly styled semi-automatic rifles that, might, another 10, 20, million of those sorts of things out there as well. So the numbers do all line up, like in terms of, historical production numbers from the last century and general, ownership reports today and numbers owned. But you do get a sense of just sort of how popular these are, how widely owned and used they are, that shows up in this survey.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so this is part of a larger project that you're working on, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show. You're writing a book. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's coming next after, you did this survey last year, you updated it in May of this year with some more information. Where are you headed next on this?
Yeah, so I've probably been thinking about this project in some ways for like 30 years. Like this is, from an early age, it's fascinating when you think about the Second Amendment broadly and just widespread popular ownership and use of firearms. In many ways, America is pretty exceptional. And it's interesting, both like historical story of how we got to where we are. And it's, partially rooted in the history of English civil wars and our, inheritance of practices from, English law, as well as English military practice, English defensive practice that, comes over. And Joyce Lee Malcolm documents a lot of this in her book on the Second Amendment that's extraordinarily rich and interesting historically. But there's sort of these, problems that go back to the origins of modern politics about, how is self-government possible? How do you get security in a society? When you think about the Black Lives Matter protest, on one level, it's understandable. People are outraged of the abuse of power that police or state agents might engage in, and this is increasingly sort of caught on camera. And that it's sort of we got this picture the last 2 or 3 years, I think, into what is actually a really difficult problem for societies. How do you guarantee security? And how do you do that in a way that recognizes, you might say, the equal political worth and equal citizenship of everyone in a self-governing Republican democracy? And I think America has sort of arrived on an interesting historical path to its present day, where this book in the first third of it tries to think about the theoretical justifications for widespread firearms ownership. What are those historically? What are those in terms of political theory? What are those in terms of practical issues of, both how do you stop crime on the street on a daily basis and have a citizenry connected with, the larger problems of security, but also how do you deal with extreme events, with, unforeseen black swan events, breakdown in the face of natural disasters. And the sort of argument in the first part of the book is that there's actually, a number of interesting historical reasons to recommend widespread firearms ownership, but then it raises all these empirical questions. And the second part of the book really is trying to deal with those. Like, what are the costs of firearms ownerships? Both in terms of crime, of misuse, of suicides. What are the benefits in terms of defensive gun use, in terms of training and responsibility, in terms of developing capacities for self-reliance in times of crisis. And for that, I'm really trying to engage the best that's been written and said, from every corner of the academic spectrum, and say, what's the best data we have that can help us evaluate this and make sort of an overall public policy cost-benefit evaluation of what are the net benefits of widespread gun ownership, what are the net costs. And then the last third of the book is thinking about what are the real challenges on the horizon. So there's definitely the political debates out there, but I kind of want to make both people on all sides of these debates a little uncomfortable and say, where do I think we have some really tough things, whether it be in better education for gun users, gun owners, whether it be in maybe getting groups that didn't usually historically own guns involved in their introduced to them and owning them and using them responsibly, to some of the hot button issues, everything from red flag laws to ghost guns and some of these emerging public policy questions. So that's the last third of the book, and it tries to suggest some possible frameworks for thinking through some of these hot button policy debates we have. But that's essentially a book in 3 parts, my major project, and trying to get that finished here in the next few months. So that's where I'm spending a lot of my time. But certainly there's going to be more coming out of this survey. I think a lot of stuff I want to drill down on with different groups, with different states to understand some of these patterns, particularly defensive patterns and concealed carry patterns. I have some other work out there looking at concealed carry and its effect on crime over time that challenges some of the existing literature, but I think it does in a very rigorous and convincing way. So this is all going into the book, and hopefully when that's finally off my desk, I can come back here and talk about its arguments in a bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have to have you on again once the book is closer to release. I'm sure it's something that will be very interesting to our audience here. You seem like you're taking the exact kind of approach that we try to take with our reporting. So I assume that many people would appreciate that and reading a more rigorous academic long form, a piece of work would probably interest a lot of people. So we'll have to have you back on at that point. Is there a way that people can follow you to keep up with the new reports the new articles that you publish or the progress on the book?
That's a great question. I'm terrible at all the social media stuff. Probably the best way. So on SSRN, it's a way that people put out academic papers, sort of preprints before they're under review or published in journals. And that right now is the major forum for releasing these academic papers. So if you look me up, William English on SSRN, this is a social science research network, and you can search, if you search National Firearms Survey, you'll probably get my name to appear. And in that space, you should see in coming months more papers appearing that are going to be analysis of the survey results. And at some point, when book chapters are ready, there'll be some teasers on there as well.
Great, and we will of course keep up to date with your writings as well over at the Reload, and so people can keep track of it there. We're obviously have several pieces on this what you've already published out there. So people should stick around and read more of that, because I think there really is a lot of fascinating stuff inside of this survey. But thank you so much for joining us. And again, we'll have to have you back on once you're closer to publish date on that book.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, for having me. Great to have this conversation, and also keep up the great work just in your reporting, because I think this is really, really important to have people out there that are trying to, get information out, and the best information on all sides, so that we can help understand these issues on a timely basis.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for the weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, here as always with Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. How are you this week, Steve?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing, Jake?
Doing all right. It's been a little bit of a long week, but hanging in there.
Yeah. Did you have a good holiday weekend at least?
Yeah, it's relaxing. Just got to catch up on some errands and hang out at home. Mostly my girlfriend was out of town, so it's kind of a bachelor's weekend for me. So pretty low key.
Nice. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not a good sign when you say it's been a long week on a short week.
Right. That's a good point. But anyways, you have an interesting story this week about one of America's largest and most storied gun makers having kind of a rough go of it in terms of their sales. If you want to tell us a little bit more about what you uncovered.
Yeah, Smith & Wesson reported their quarterly earnings for their first quarter of this year, which ended in July, and sales were down 69%, which is incredible. They went from $274.6 million in sales the first quarter of 2021 to just $84.4 million in the first quarter of 2022. So, that's a drop of $190 million, which is insane. But it shows you quite a lot about what the state of the gun market today. You had 2 years of extremely hot gun sales. The market was just exploding, and now it's receding. It's going back down to where you might expect it to be, in a normal, non-pandemic, non-riot environment. Now that still, to be fair, is elevated from where it was before 2020, and Smith & Wesson's financials reflect that, but this is obviously the end of an era, the end of an incredible record-breaking surge, for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's important context, because obviously when you hear of a company declining revenue nearly 70%, obviously that might raise some red flags among some people, but it is important to know that is coming off of a absolute historic period of gun sales, where at one point I believe they had something like $1 billion in revenue because sales were just that high, that extreme.
They had the first $1 billion sales year for any gun company in American history.
Right.
So, coming off of that, they're now seeing their sales recede back down to lower levels. And you've seen this trend. Ruger reported similar drops in sales, although this drop was more severe than Ruger's. But those are the two American publicly traded gun companies, by the way. So those are the two of the largest The other ones, we don't necessarily get their financials because they're not public companies. So this is how you can judge how the industry is doing. And these are the only two you could potentially buy stakes in, right? As a normal investor on the market. So that's another reason why what's happening with them matters quite a lot. But yeah, I mean, this is a trend that you've seen coming for a while now, really based on the FBI's background check numbers, which are the best analog for sales. They don't tally 1-to-1 each gun sale. There's several reasons why, you're not capturing every gun sale with those FBI background check numbers. For instance, they're not done on all gun sales, or you can buy multiple guns on a single check, or you could use a concealed carry license in place of a check. So there's a lot of different reasons why the numbers don't match up exactly, but they are the best analog, and they've been decreasing significantly since their peaks in 2020. They were down again last month from 2021 August to 2022 of August, and but not by a ton. They're still leveling out again above their pre-pandemic levels. So this reflects that, I would say.
Right. And I believe there's still over 1 million a month, which is still relatively high considering historical trends. One thing I will say that'll be interesting to take a look at with revenue from companies like Smith & Wesson and Ruger is these last quarterly earnings reports end in July. And you've seen sort of since then kind of a big assault weapons push in the political arena. And obviously we're getting into midterm season, election season, which can also have an effect in gun sales. Obviously it's not a presidential election, which tends to be the biggest drivers of gun sales. But still, you could see when things like assault weapons bans are in the realm of possibility, depending on which way the election goes, you could see another possible spike again. So that will be, I think, one thing to keep in mind for maybe future earnings reports to see if maybe we see a slight rebound. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, this is a trailing indicator, right? Because these are figures that ended in July. And so we don't see what happened, in August and so far in September.
Right.
And there have been some political developments like the assault weapons ban passed in the House that you mentioned. We'll also have to track where exactly that is having an impact or how much of an impact it's having. Because again, I mean, there is some thought that perhaps people who want to buy an AR-15, they were already motivated to do that the last 2 years before this assault weapons ban passed. So whether it'll have the same kind of impact previous political fights have had, it remains to be seen. But you're right that they're positioned for a potential rebound just based off the political environment. And Smith & Wesson is fairly well positioned to take advantage of any sort of spike in demand that comes along. Their CFO, Dina McPherson, said, quote, "Our balance sheet remains strong with $115 million of cash and no debt, and we expect to continue generating strong cash flow for the foreseeable future." So it's not as though Smith & Wesson is going out of business, as you might, someone might worry with the numbers like this. The business is just coming back down from its all-time highs to what may constitute a new normal. We've been talking about that for a while at the Reload, this new normal. Where's the new normal? What's the new bottom? And so it seems we might be getting to that new bottom for gun sales. And again, it still remains elevated over the previous highs, before 2020. So it's not catastrophic news for the gun industry. It's just something that was expected to happen and now is happening. The surge can't last forever.
Right. Yeah. It's just returning to a more sustainable level of revenue, as you said. One thing I think, aside from the political development of the AR-15, this might be a little bit more speculative on my end, but maybe one more thing that you could see a possible rebound in is the Supreme Court's gun carry decision. You suddenly have 7 or so states where more and more people will, at least in theory, be able to get carry permits. Smith & Wesson sells plenty of guns that plenty of people choose to carry. I, for example, carry a Smith & Wesson gun for my personal everyday carry. So you could see maybe a rebound in sales in some of these very populous states where suddenly people can get carry permits. So that might be one thing to keep an eye on as well.
Yeah. I mean, the company, first off, they reported selling nearly 60,000 handguns in that last quarter and 14,000 long guns, so rifles and shotguns. But of course, that was out of 128,000 handguns that they actually shipped,
Right.
and 28,000 long guns. So, they report that a lot of their retailers were selling through inventory, and so they were replenishing stock, but they expect that to not be as much of a problem in the future. I would say that you're right. The Supreme Court's decision and the subsequent liberalization of gun carry laws throughout the country in some of the most populous states like California, New York, New Jersey, Maryland will probably have an impact long-term, or more like mid-term, I would say, on Smith & Wesson and these other gun makers. Smith & Wesson is a big player in that market, like you mentioned. I used to carry a Smith & Wesson. You carry one now. I might switch to the new Shield Plus, so we'll see. There's a lot of good options out there, of course, but they're certainly one of the most popular, and I think they will benefit eventually from that. The problem is, of course, as we've covered extensively, there's been a lot of backlash to that ruling in those states, and it's not really much easier to carry in most of them today than it was before the Supreme Court's ruling. So I don't think that surge in sales is going to come until later on down the line, and especially in a place like California, right, which has their handgun roster that's extremely restrictive, and I don't believe you can buy a Shield in California legally, which is
don't believe so either.
The popular Smith & Wesson carry gun. So it might take a couple of years for that effect to actually be seen in their balance sheets. So I wouldn't expect.
That's a good point.
Yeah, like it's not next quarter isn't going to see the effects of that. Most likely, maybe in Maryland, where people can actually get permits at the moment, but probably not in California and New York, which is really where if you're looking at financial gain, it's something that's going to matter to the balance sheet of a company like Smith & Wesson. You want to see a lot more people in California and New York being able to buy
the biggest markets.
They're huge markets. So, but I think you're right. Mid to long term, that probably will have an impact. And I think I don't know what Smith & Wesson's stock price is at right now. I don't know how the market was perceiving them, but if it goes too low, maybe then it would be a good investment opportunity, because these numbers are really ugly for a single quarter, but it's unlikely that they're going to crash completely out. They're likely to have a pretty stable and secure financial footing moving forward. It's just not going to be the 2020 levels that we saw.
Right. No. Yeah. It's just like you said, it's coming back down to a sustainable level. It's hard to sustain record pace for as long as they did. So.
Exactly. So even with all those new gun owners that were created in the last 2 years, it doesn't mean that they're going to be able to keep sales at insane levels that were never seen before. So we'll keep an eye on it, though. We'll certainly be watching Smith & Wesson's earnings reports and Ruger's and all the other indicators for gun sales in America and how things are going. So if you are interested in that aspect of our reporting, you should absolutely head over to thereload.com and sign up for our free newsletter. And if you want a bit more in-depth analysis on these situations and on these stories, make sure you become a member. You'll get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces of analysis and exclusive stories that you can't find anywhere else. You'll also get this podcast a day early, and you'll get the chance to appear on the podcast. I think we have a members interview lined up for next week, actually. Actually, the member of the Liberal Gun Club, which I spoke to recently. So make sure you stick around for that one. But that could be you if you want to. Maybe you're a member of a different club, the Conservative Gun Club. I don't know, whatever. You feel free to reach out and come on the show. We love to have on members and hear their stories from all across the country and the political divide and all other kinds of dividing lines. So but that's it. That's all we got for this week. We'll see you guys again next week.